The giant chasm between the legacy media and reality has never been as clear as it is now, amid the fallout from a shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. A man was apparently trying to shoot Trump administration officials. One Secret Service agent was shot but was wearing a bulletproof vest and, as of now, is doing fine. For years, news agencies have been ignoring or downplaying left wing violence in America. Here on this show, I've told you about big incidents that go unmentioned by the news. Left wing terror attacks in New York that don't make the front page of the New York Times, while right wing violence outside of New York does. NPR, CNN, the Associated Press, and other alleged mainstream news agencies keep running cover for left wing hate movements, and they're constantly churning out content designed to radicalize people on the left even further. If you're new to this show, you should know this isn't some theory. It's concrete and backed up by lots of studies and research. Ahead, I'll tell you where you can see all that for yourself. So now this shooter opens fire at a gala in front of journalists, and his so called manifesto is filled with left wing talking points. The media is shocked. Shocked. How could this happen? Well, if you opened your eyes, you would know this kind of thing is already happening. Ahead, what the data shows about left wing and right wing violence in America, especially among young people. Just days ago, students at my alma mater, one of these elite northern schools, were applauding for a pro violent, pro terror, far left streamer. But the media keeps pretending he is, oh, so harmless. I'll explain. Plus, a former guest from this show, Mike Pesca, points out something important about what the authorities did to the shooter at the gala and the profound hypocrisy of the media not caring. Meanwhile, another big media issue: anonymous sources. Should you trust them? When should the media use them? And how? I've been getting questions like that from a bunch of you because of what's going on with the FBI. The Atlantic published a piece saying that Kash Patel, the FBI director, is MIA, missing in action. Quote, the FBI director has alarmed colleagues with episodes of excessive drinking and unexplained absences. The piece is sourced anonymously, which does not mean it's wrong. It could be right. But the media has overused and misused anonymous sourcing for so long, to the point that now no one has good reason to trust pieces like this. Today, the new questions about Kash Patel and whether this report should set off alarm bells. Also, in responding to this, Patel said some things about his record that make no sense, but the media parroted those. I'll explain. Also, the vice president who referred to an anonymous source as I, and the Trump administration isn't just into alternative facts, it's also into alternative math. The latest nonsensical claims that the media just went with. Coming up on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So great to have you here. My name is Josh Levs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news. I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, where I became basically the lead on air fact checker. But I've always wanted to correct the media. And now that I'm outside big corporate owned media, I am able to do so freely. Along with the show comes a newsletter. I don't expect you to take my word for anything, and I want you to get that. The newsletter is free. You'll find a link in the show notes. It's on Substack, and it's called They Stand Corrected. The people making this show possible are those who choose to become paid subscribers to the newsletter. They get extra content, including annotated, hyperlinked transcripts, social media stuff, a bunch of things. And they do the most to set the agenda for this show. In fact, a question from a subscriber, Ruth in Las Vegas, led to one of the topics on this show. So thank you, Ruth. And ahead, I'll let you all know how you can send in your questions, links you want me to fact check, and more. I strategically use two specific methods. But for now, let's dig into the hellish state of the news because we need sanity amid this madness. The shooting at this gala in Washington, D.C. As I record this, the latest reporting is that the apparent gunman Cole Thomas Allen is a 31-year-old, and that's significant. I'll come back to that. He's from Los Angeles. He has spent time as a teacher. There's a website showing that he was once Teacher of the Month at this organization, so that's been getting some attention. He decided he wanted to kill Trump administration officials, and he apparently sent a note to his family just minutes in advance of the attack. It's now being referred to as a manifesto. I have explained that we usually should try to avoid giving a lot of attention to shooters, giving them the fame they might be seeking, and spreading their manifesto messages. But sometimes there is something to be learned from it. So I'm going to tell you about what we need to learn from this. His message is a summary of left-wing radicalization and violence. He presents himself in these moral terms, claiming that he'll only shoot other people if necessary in order to get to his targets, although he also says they chose to be in the room with the president. So in a way, he's saying they're legitimate targets. He, of course, presents himself as acting on behalf of, and this is important, oppressed people. Here's a line from CBS News on their website. The shooter then went on to list several anonymous hypothetical victims. I've talked about this on the show. Victim narratives are a centerpiece of radicalization, and the media keeps feeding victim narratives, overwhelming people with them. I've explained that on the right, it's you're a victim of immigrants or deep state or whatever. On the left, it's what this guy did. On the left, it's you are privileged. And in order to be a good person, you must act on behalf of the following people who are victims. And I, the progressive activist, often progressive activists who have overtaken the media, am the one who tells you who the victims are. Anything is allowed if you're acting on their behalf. That is what this line, any means necessary, refers to in these crazy protests. These folks never mean the word necessary. They mean literally anything you do is okay if it's on behalf of people whom you have decided count as oppressed. That is why people celebrated the October 7th massacres. That's why so many young people support the guy who shot the head of a health insurance company. I reported recently on the Global Terrorism Index, discussing how terrorism in the West is on the rise. That report specifically cites Islamo-leftism, this growth in violent movements and connections between leftist movements in the West and Islamist movements. Killing people while claiming righteousness is what these groups are all about. As I mentioned, this guy, this shooter, is 31 years old. He's part of a generation that has been radicalized by mimetic warfare since they were adolescents, kids. Their minds have been shaped around this stuff. Now, let's look at numbers. Last year, I shared data with you. It's been a while, so I'll talk you through a couple of data points here, and you can find the links in my newsletter. A group called CPost tracks support for political violence in America. Here's something the head of it wrote last year. Our May survey was the most worrisome. About 40% of Democrats supported the use of force to remove Mr. Trump from the presidency, and about 25% of Republicans supported the use of the military to stop protests against Mr. Trump's agenda. These numbers more than doubled since last fall. That quote is from a New York Times op-ed. So you could say, oh, okay, well, the media gave it attention. But here's what actually happens. The media gives left-wing violence lip service. Most people don't know that that op-ed even ran. The New York Times itself refuses to listen to the warning in there. The Times keeps burying or not even mentioning left-wing terrorism, left-wing violence, the violence by these crazy kids at encampments on college campuses. From big mainstream media, you would have no idea how much of this is going on. In a previous episode, I explained that when Islamist terrorists launched bombs recently outside the mayor's mansion in New York, they were trying to kill anti-Islamist protesters and police and passersby. The New York Times did not bother to put that on the main page. I had to keep scrolling and scrolling past tons of other stuff, including a glowing profile of a guy who is a pro-terror radical from Columbia University. Meanwhile, when Nazis gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia, several years ago, that was on the New York Times front page. This is normal, and it's getting worse. There's also a data point from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Quote, students who are the furthest to the left have been the most accepting of violence For as long as we've asked the question, that includes very liberal and democratic socialist students. But a rising tide of acceptance of violence has raised all boats. And then they go on to say what was once an extreme and fringe position has become normalized. This past weekend, I was interviewed on a podcast called Shadow Politics with Michael D. Brown. Thanks to the folks there for having me. He was Washington, D.C.'s shadow senator, which is a person there representing the District of Columbia who does not get to vote because Washington does not have a vote in the Senate, which is crazy. Anyway, he's a Democrat, and we spoke beforehand and during the show. And he told me he was surprised by all this. He had no idea. Most people don't, because in big mainstream media, right-wing violence is front page news. Left-wing violence is comparatively nothing to see here, folks. Instead, they're making it worse by constantly feeding the rage machine with headlines designed to further people's hatred. A former guest on this show, the awesome Mike Pesca, pointed out something important. In the images from the White House Correspondents Association dinner, you can see this in my newsletter and Instagram. The shooter, when he's being held on the ground, you can see that he was stripped, at least of his shirt. Mike wrote a note on my Substack post. He wrote, "Oh, look, they took off his clothes. Standard operating procedure for someone who might be a terrorist or war crime." Interesting to see how many of the hundreds of journalists in the room alleged war crime in this case when it is their safety that is being protected. Here's what Mike is referring to. From everything that I have seen, none of the journalists called it a war crime. And yet, when Israel captures potential terrorists, fighting age males in areas that civilians were told to evacuate, Israel has stripped down the men to underwear to make sure they don't have any weapons. And of course, that is nothing compared to the constant sexual violence that prisoners from Israel suffered through for months on end in Gaza's tunnels. But images of Israeli forces having stripped people when they were captured, of course, became literally the biggest story on earth, a massive scandal with all these people claiming war crimes. I pulled up an example for you, and this is so telling. This was a report from December 2023 on CNN. First, they gave this warning.
We have some disturbing new images. Some viewers may find these images upsetting. We do want to warn our viewers.
Then they went to their reporter. This is someone I've talked about on this show. I've corrected him. He openly lies. His name is Jeremy Diamond.
While we don't know whether some of these men may be Hamas fighters, we know that all of them are not. And that's because some of these men have already been identified by their relatives, some of whom spoke with CNN. Among them includes at least one journalist, a correspondent for Al Arabiya Al Jadid, who was identified by his employer. You can see these men in these images. They are blindfolded. They have been stripped down to their underwear.
You heard Jeremy say that CNN knew for a fact that some of these were not terrorists. That was not true. CNN did not know that. What CNN had were claims from some family members who, of course, would claim that these folks are not terrorists, and a claim from a so-called news network. He, of course, didn't tell you that that network is owned by a Qatari business leader with close ties to the Qatari government. But to CNN, those claims count as fact, but nothing Israel says counts as fact. I should also point out that Islamist terrorists sometimes have bombs in underwear. Some of you might remember back in 2009, there was the so-called underwear bomber who boarded a U.S. flight on Christmas Day and tried to set off explosives in his underwear, but didn't manage to. Anyway, these images from Israel were, of course, the exact kind of fodder that the media wants. Here's why this particular clip is so telling. Immediately before this segment, CNN had a report from my hometown, Albany, New York.
That 28-year-old man took a shotgun and fired 2 times outside of Temple Israel, a synagogue just west of downtown Albany earlier this afternoon. Again, nobody hurt. But when you hear from Police Chief Eric Hawkins, he says that the suspect shouted "Free Palestine" during the incident before attempting to flee.
That was also my synagogue growing up. There were kids inside when this guy went to that synagogue and shot. CNN went straight from that to Big Bad Israel stripping prisoners. How dare they? And the same news agencies say nothing about this guy being stripped to any extent because it's their safety at risk. The media does not own its own hypocrisy. It doesn't even realize its own hypocrisy. The media's favorite streamer, I've told you about him, this openly pro-violence guy, Hassan Piker, who praises terrorists, who says these repugnant, disgusting things, who had encouraged the assassination of a senator, later on tried to claim these things are hyperbole, but keeps doing it. He's openly anti-America, anti-democracy, pro-communist, anti-Semitic, pro-terror. He just spoke at Yale the other day and, of course, got a lot of applause, as he does, from radicalized people all the time. This is going to keep getting worse. But there's a lesson that we can learn. There's something we can do. It involves something that just happened in Hungary and that the opposition is now doing in Israel. If only the American media would realize this and point it out. That's coming up. But first, is the FBI director missing in action? That is what a new report claims, but it runs up against Americans' understandable wariness of the media and anonymous sources. Do you remember the little engine that could? Let's talk about that for a second. The dangerous polarization taking over our society is being fueled by the media. And there's a reason for that. The market rewards it. These days, if you join a big lie of the right or the left, it's like you are put on a bullet train that speeds to numeric success. This show goes against the market, and so it is a much tougher, harder path to grow this show. We need your support to grow this movement for truth, to help fuel this train up the hill. Here are things you can do. Yes, you can become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. That's helpful. Also, there are free things you can do. Rate and review this show on the platforms, wherever you're listening to it now. Everyone who does that makes a huge difference because that's how those algorithms work. Tell individuals about this show. Contact someone you know and say, I think you specifically would find this episode interesting, and here's why. You can also sponsor episodes and tell sponsors about the episodes. You can find out all this information in the show notes and at my website, joshlevs.com. Let's root for truth so our society can come together. And let's prove to the market that you don't have to join a big lie to succeed. With your help, we can get there. Thank you. Days ago, The Atlantic reported on alleged concerning behavior by FBI Director Kash Patel, including excessive drinking. Here is a quote from their story. He is erratic, suspicious of others, and prone to jumping to conclusions before he has necessary evidence. According to the more than 24 people I interviewed about Patel's conduct, including current and former FBI officials, staff at law enforcement and intelligence agencies, hospitality industry workers, members of Congress, political operatives, lobbyists, and former advisors. All right, so that's a laundry list of those anonymous sources. And in total, we're talking at least 25 people because it says more than 24. According to this article, these folks spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive information and private conversations. Patel denies these allegations, and he has now filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic. The Atlantic says it stands by its reporting. Here's the big picture. There are times when anonymous sources are important for reporting. The most famous example is Watergate. Sometimes anonymous sources get you crucial information, and for their own safety or other understandable reasons, they can't come forward or are not comfortable doing so. The news has responsibilities with this stuff. News agencies are supposed to do everything they can to try to get information on the record, which means even if an anonymous source brings you information, you try to find someone who will go on the record and say the same things. And you try to reach out to people on the record who might say different things, who might refute that. You also have to really explore this person's potential motivation for coming forward. I'm not inside the Atlantic. I can't tell you exactly what happened here, but I can tell you this. The media lost Americans' trust for good reason. First of all, as I report here every week, the media gets things wrong all the time. So just in general, the media has lost Americans' trust. The Atlantic is not one of the first outlets I think of as major mainstream media, but they are their own kind of news powerhouse. And I have pointed out things that they got wrong. Let's see, in episode 70 about Matt Lauer, I pointed out that the Atlantic ran a piece saying this, quote, perhaps the single most horrifying detail from the litany of stories alleging sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior by Matt Lauer is his secret button. They then mentioned a story in Variety that alleged that Matt Lauer, when he was at NBC, had some button that locked the door to his office. And this piece in The Atlantic added, whether it's a mundane precautionary tool or an accessory worthy of a Bond villain, it's also a concrete manifestation of a reality reflected in so many of these recent allegations, the unabridged power and protection that accompany celebrity. That is a lot of words about something that turned out not to exist. There was no such button. The Atlantic did not change its story or seem to care. Also, I did an episode about the left-wing outlet New York Magazine running an attack piece against Senator John Fetterman that was filled with anonymous sources making claims about his mental health. After that came out, a piece in The Atlantic tried to justify it, but that piece in The Atlantic left out basic information. All of this is in previous episodes, so I won't rehash all of it for you. I always encourage people to listen to every episode. Go back to episode 1. They build on top of each other. Anyway, these allegations about Patel do matter. And The Atlantic points out accurately that the DOJ's ethics handbook says an employee is prohibited from habitually using alcohol or other intoxicants to excess. Maybe these allegations are true, but the media has to earn your trust, especially when it comes to anonymously sourced information. Kash Patel is insisting it's not true, but he says false things all the time, too. I've corrected him here on this show. You might remember after an Afghan refugee killed 2 U.S. National Guard members in December, Patel said the Biden administration had failed to vet this refugee and countless others in any way, shape, or form. That was factually false. It is quite possible that many people were not adequately vetted, but it's not true that they were not vetted in any way, shape, or form. Meanwhile, in his own remarks slamming The Atlantic now, Kash Patel has been saying things about his own record that don't make sense. Like this.
This FBI director has been on the job twice as many days as every director before me. What that means is I've taken half as many days off as those before me. What that means is I've taken a third less vacation than those before me.
Huh? None of those things mean the same thing. I saw that quote when a listener alerted me to it. It was in news reports, and no one was correcting it or apparently trying to figure out what any of it even means. Previous directors have served for years and years, so he definitely has not been on the job twice as many days. And if he's taken half as many days off, that isn't the same thing as being on the job twice as many days and a third less vacation. What? I did finally find one report in which the FBI said Patel took 17 days off during his first year, which is less than half the number of days his predecessor took off during that same time period. But especially in a case like this, when you're saying the media is so wrong, maybe an FBI director should prepare his remarks so they make sense when he talks to the media. Meanwhile, his 19-page lawsuit filing against The Atlantic has a bunch of typos in it. You would think the people involved, including lawyers, would have caught those, even with very basic software. This is where the American people are left, with a media that regularly says false things and has failed to earn your trust, and government officials who also do both those things. There is a guy who worked with Patel through the transition into his FBI role, Clint Brown. He is on social media saying he never saw any sign of this and asking why The Atlantic didn't contact him, since they might have wondered whether any of this was a problem for Patel before he took office. I asked Clint whether he has heard from The Atlantic for a follow-up story, and he said no. Here is a person on the record saying something that has relevance. I don't see a good editorial reason to avoid a follow-up that includes this guy and maybe others who will say things on the record. I have asked The Atlantic about this, but I've not heard back. So This situation of The Atlantic versus Kash Patel, that is a mess. But here's the general issue for the news world. The media uses anonymity all the time, way too much. News executives claim that they're careful with this stuff, but they don't stick to their own alleged rules. The Associated Press, in its so called rules, says the bar against anonymous content is set high. The AP also says that when they use anonymous sources, they must have a good reason. And when relevant, they must disclose the person's motivation for disclosing the information. I searched AP News stories for anonymous sources and found that they use them all the time. Senior officials said, sometimes they say because the person was not permitted to speak on the record. That doesn't tell us anything about their motivation for doing it anyway. Sometimes the AP just says the person is speaking on condition of anonymity in line with regulations. So a regulation inside a government agency can say you're allowed to speak, but it has to be anonymous, and then news agencies have to go with that? They don't. Here is one that just says someone spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss the information. Well, yeah, that's what they're doing. They're discussing the information anonymously. There's no explanation or discussion of motivation or whatever. And it's not just AP. News agencies claim things all the time about how they allegedly handle anonymous stuff. NPR, less than a year ago, put a piece on their website about their alleged rules. Here's one line from it. One thing that our readers and listeners won't find in an NPR story is pseudonyms, because those are made up, and we want to report only facts. That's nice. Here's an NPR segment from this month.
There's keeping a low profile. And then there's James Wolfe. Not his real name, that's a pseudonym.
They don't tell us his real name at any point. That segment is with an author who was apparently an ex-spy, and that might be a fine time to use a pseudonym. But don't tell us you have rules when you obviously don't. And it's not like this is a one-off. Here's an NPR story from before they wrote that you'll never see a pseudonym.
Liam's not his real name. We're using it because his sexuality could put his family in danger. Azerbaijan, where he grew up, is a predominantly Muslim country that used to be a part of the Soviet Union. It's a conservative, authoritarian state. Even though homosexuality was legalized a couple decades ago, honor killings still happen there. And a few years ago, the Azerbaijani police carried out a series of raids against LGBTQ+ people.
That report says people in Azerbaijan turn in others, even people who think they're their friends, for being gay, and that this guy's own father threatened to kill him. These can be good times to use anonymity, even pseudonyms. So why claim that you don't? Probably because the media doesn't expect anyone to fact check them. And no one does until now. Anonymity should be very rare. It isn't. In a previous episode, I told you about a study from the Washington Institute that found the media was letting people in Gaza say anything they wanted anonymously. At that time, the Washington Post was the worst offender in that study. The issue of anonymous sourcing can cause real dangers. Here is a particularly memorable example from my days at CNN that some people still talk about to this day. After two young Islamist terrorists bombed the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and wounding more than 260, CNN infamously reported this.
Well, if we have information, one of our sources is from our national security contributor, Fran Townsend. One of sources is a Boston law enforcement source who tells me that an arrest has been made in the investigation
so the
here in
suspect
Boston.
that was identified has now been arrested.
We would assume that. I've just been told that an arrest has been made.
In reality, no arrest had been made, and they went on with this for about an hour. Both of the terrorists who had carried out that attack were hiding in a residential neighborhood. Authorities had not found them. This, from CNN, was life-endangering bad information. For that time, people were breathing a sigh of relief, and meanwhile, 2 dangerous terrorists could have killed people. They were in Watertown, Massachusetts. CNN ended up pulling back and trying to say, oh, our sources were wrong, but why go with them? What's the point of sharing something like that anonymously? Just wait until there is an arrest. This rush to feel that you're first, that you have exclusive information, blinds the media to what matters. There's no benefit to rushing with information like that. I remember from the newsroom that day because I was saying, why are we going with this? But the decision came from on high that we had to. It's no wonder people have no clue what to believe when it comes to anonymous sources. There is a solution to all this coming up. News agencies routinely allow presidential administrations preposterous leeway in saying things anonymously, so no one can be held responsible if it was wrong. Maybe the biggest example of how preposterous this is took place back in the George W. Bush era. In 2007, here is what a senior administration official said in a transcript released by the White House. This unnamed official was discussing then Vice President Dick Cheney's trip to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I would describe my sessions, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, as very productive. I've seen some press reporting that says Cheney went in and beat up on them, threatened them. That's not the way I work. The idea that I'd go in and threaten someone is an invalid misreading of the way I do business. Even when the White House was asked about this at the time, they said no, they were keeping those quotes as being from a senior administration official. No wonder people are skeptical of this whole inside the beltway gamesmanship thing. Speaking of that, I have reported in the past that the White House Correspondents Association dinner should not exist. It is a disgusting sign of what is supposed to be an independent media partying and joking around with the people they are supposed to be holding responsible for the truth on behalf of the American people. It's also a disgusting sign of the news media's desperation to feel celebrity adjacent. I've also reported about conspiracy theories and how quickly they form after an act of violence, including an assassination attempt. They are driven by the myth of invincibility, this assumption that such a thing couldn't possibly happen because security must be better than it very often is. Conspiracies do happen, but these theories form way more often and without evidence. Amid all this madness, there is maybe a hopeful sign in the world. I discussed previously that in Hungary, the far left pulled out of a recent election and instead came together in a more centrist coalition that worked. Now there's a similar effort underway in Israel, which has done it in the past. Israel had the world's most politically diverse coalition before the current one, and now two opposition leaders are coming together to try to challenge the current majority there. Those are both parliamentary democracies. In that kind of a government, smaller parties can make a big difference because you end up having to assemble voting blocks to create a majority. Here in America, we vote directly for president, but it can be helpful to look around the world and see people in a democracy come together and move away from deeply entrenched extremes. If Americans do that, maybe we could reduce the growing support for political violence. The media won't help. Clicks come from rage. But I see people coming together here, and they stand corrected. I'm always hearing from people who say they place themselves on the right or the left. They tune in for every episode because they care about truth. That gives me hope. Hate mongers will continue to push their same campaigns no matter who is in office, here or in Hungary or in Israel. But a coalition that rejects extremes can reduce the power of those hate mongers. In the meantime, let's encourage everyone we know to tune out the haters. Invite them here to get facts plus context. I would love to hear from you, of course. There are two great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter, and the second is through a form at my website, joshlebs.com. You will find links in the show notes. Before you go, be sure to look at whatever app you're using to listen to this and subscribe, rate, and review. It makes a huge difference. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.